You're listening to Salford City Radio 94.4 FM, the Friday Sports Show. Your host, Jimmy Petruzzi, bringing you news from local area and around the world. We're really fortunate in this show to have interviewed some of the world's best athletes, sports people, coaches. We have a segment that we speak to some of the world's most influential people in field psychology and related fields. Today we have a really fascinating guest. He's going to give us an insight into his sort of career in sport, in rugby, as well as his work as financial advisor and an ambassador of Cheshire Business School. So Chris Jones, welcome to the show. Great to have you on board.
Thanks for having me.
Fantastic. So Chris, just for our listeners, can you give us an insight into your career in rugby, sort of like what inspired you to go into rugby, and how would you sort of, summarise like your sort of playing rugby?
I was pretty lucky myself. So I started playing rugby at my school, Salford City, and just playing it for fun. Wasn't having the aspirations to go professional when I was older. And rugby kind of found me and took hold of me. When I was 21, I was 20, I was playing for Sale Sharks under 21s. Again, I was travelling back from university to play for them. And again, just for a bit of enjoyment, really. And I wanted to try and play at the highest possible level I could.
Yeah.
And Sale Sharks offered that. And then after 3 years at university, I did 1 year at Sale Sharks 21s. They asked me if I wanted to start on professional, so that's what I did. Then I went to have a meeting with Steve Diamond and Jim Allender. Steve Diamond said, you'll never play professional, you're not big enough, just hope me. So he said, we're hoping you'll develop, we're hoping you'll get bigger, and we'll take a bit of a gamble on that. And so they sent me on loan to Files, and just to move up really, Sale Sharks had a bit of an injury crisis. They called me back, and they sat me on the bench and said, we need to send you on the bench so we don't get fined. But we're not planning to bring you on. And then by half time we'd had another injury crisis, and I'd had my chance. And I took it with both hands, and I suppose it's history. 16 years later, I had a wonderful career and managed to get 12 England caps. We won the Premiership at Sale in 2006. We won, I think, 2 European Shields as well on the way. So it was, I had a fantastic career. We all started out with a conversation telling me I've never played professional rugby.
That's really inspiring, I think, Chris. There's not a lot of listeners. We have a lot of sports people, or people just in general, listen to the show, and I think that's sort of, an inspiring, I think, to show sometimes someone might have an opinion. But obviously, you keep going and see where things. Obviously, we went as far as you can go in your sport. But obviously, there's plenty of people out there who sometimes may not have maybe that sort of mental strength and take that on board. So it's always, if you love what you do, you keep going. What was it like to play for England, Chris? I mean, obviously, there's no bigger honour, I would think, for than that in terms of how would you describe your sort of experience of sort of playing at that level?
Well, do you know what? For me, I was quite lucky to Clive Woodward. He always coaches. Some coaches like the way he plays some stuff down. Always supported me and liked the way I played. But it was nerve-wracking. So the first game I played for England was the first game after they'd won the World Cup. So you've got a team full of legends, and a couple of them are retired, which meant I got my chance. So you've got this team that have been together for years. They've just won the World Cup. They're on a high. So it's kind of nervous. The way I used to deal with most of those big occasions was kind of distance myself from it, and try not to get overly psyched up, because I'd end up giving away too many penalties. So it's just more, I tried to step back and enjoy the experience. And as I said before, I enjoyed playing rugby as a child. And when I was told I wasn't going to play rugby, I thought, well, I'm just going to play as high level as I can and enjoy it. And so when I got with England, that's exactly what I did. I tried to sit back and just enjoy the experience, enjoy the moment, and knowing that's sort of how I got my best performances. And again, I mentioned before about some great players that were in the squad that just won the World Cup. That gave me the opportunity to be able to step back, enjoy the moment, and they had all the structures in place, and I could just play a bit more of my free flowing game that I over in the way they play. So yeah, it all worked well for me, and I just tried to not let the nerves get to me and just enjoy that moment.
Absolutely. No, I can imagine sort of like the dressing room with some of the players. Obviously it was a strong team and some strong characters, I would imagine. In terms of like what was that experience like for yourself, Chris? Sort of, I can imagine some people would be, maybe I wouldn't say overawed, but you walk into a dressing room and you look around and think, wow, there's some sort of really strong characters here. What was the sort of feeling for yourself to sort of like to have that experience?
Well, for me, again, it was quite different because rugby found me. I wasn't, a die-hard rugby follower as a child. I just wanted to play sports, whether that was rugby, football, cricket. So I didn't grow up watching these players thinking, oh my goodness, one day, what if. Yeah. So then, when rugby found me, it was fairly quickly that I got on the side at Sale. It was fairly quickly after that I went on a couple of sevens tours, and then fairly quickly after that I was brought into the England squad. So it was all very quick. So I didn't have this pretense of getting into a change room thinking, oh my God, look at that player, or I'm that player. For me, I just went in there and I was fairly young, and when you're young, you're a little bit blasé about some of these things, and you can just brush them off really. So I wasn't going to these dressing rooms, and I wasn't going up against opposition thinking, and no one was on a pedestal for me to revere and be a bit nervous about meeting. I just went in, and treated them like I thought they'd treat me, just as a player, and we wanted the best out of the team.
Absolutely. I suppose you're playing against some of these players week by week as well, Chris, in terms of your own experience. I mean, did you find that? I mean, it's interesting, really, with you, sort of like the career in terms of obviously rugby sort of changed over the years in terms of like the professionalism and everything else. What was it like for yourself in terms of training at Sale? What was the experience like in terms of the training itself, day by day, and preparing for matches, and the actual like the training like for you?
Oh, you mean the transition from Sale to England? Or is this just in general, what was the training like?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it's like in terms of, say, rugby, like we've seen over the years, it's sort of like develops, become professional, and when you enter the game, obviously at that point, sort of the game was, from my perspective, advancing rapidly in England type thing, and sort of it was moving more towards, obviously it was moved towards professional really, but like the training itself, day by day at Sale, how would you describe that for the listeners at that time?
Yeah, well, at that time when I first started playing for Sale, it was a strange one because we were, it was a smaller club, but we had some phenomenal players, captained by Brian Redpath, one of the greatest scrum halves ever, and we slowly started getting better week on week, month on month, and fairly quickly we sort of instated ourselves in the top half of the league, and like I mentioned before, picked up a couple of European Shields, and then from when I started in sort of 2001-ish, by 2006, we were top of the league and we won the league, and so we had such a good squad, and we had Jim Allender, one of my first years at the helm, they just took the pressure off the players, or maybe handed it to the more experienced guys really. Which meant that the younger lads, and there were quite a few of us coming through, we had Charlie Hodgson, Mark Quato, Andy Titterell, and so some phenomenal players, but we were given free rein just to express ourselves, and once you have a coach that's doing that, suddenly, you're getting the best out of the players, but like you said, like professionalism, it was always professionalism. The first few years, you had Jim Allender and Steve Diamond who played through the amateur era into the professional era, so we had also that touch of being grounded, professional, but also a little bit of mix of the amateur. So when we got the opportunity to go out as a team, we would do, so they had a nice blend together really. The training was tough, it was really tough. When you went to England, it stepped up again. When I went to England, I'd finished my week of training with England, and you're thinking, well, can I play on the weekend? Because your body's just so fatigued. And so once I
absolutely. And I mean, it's interesting you say like the international. What would you say the difference is in terms of, you mentioned that is it playing international level? Say obviously you're playing for Sale, then you're playing for England. Is there a difference in intensity that the game itself? I mean, how would you describe playing international rugby compared to club rugby, Chris?
For me personally, I thought there was definitely was a step up. I think the personal pressure you put on yourself to do as much as you can at the top flight level. Mentally, there's a lot more on it because you're a club, you play week in, week out. You generally know all the players around you because you've all been there a considerable time together. Without really thinking, you know the plays, you know the structures, you know the ins and outs. And then you leave that environment and you go into a camp for a couple of weeks with a new set of players who you don't know how they play. You're learning a whole new set of maybe line-out calls. You're learning new patterns of play. The coach will want you to play in a certain way. So mentally, there's a lot more to think of. But then obviously, the opposition you play. If you play in the league, you're going to play against some phenomenal players. But you'd also play against some young players or some weaker players. At the international level, you lose a lot of that because everyone's phenomenal. So everyone has to step it up a gear for international for sure.
Yeah, and that's interesting, and like insight for our listeners, and in terms of the sort of differences, really different sort of challenges as well. That the different sort of levels. The experience itself, I think, is quite fascinating in terms of like the difference between, say, club in any sport really to international level as well. And in terms of highlights, I know there's a lot of highlights. You could probably do a whole show on highlights. But is there anything that sort of sticks to mind in your sort of career, Chris, when you reflect back on and think, well, this was any sort of highlights, big highlights for yourself that you look back on?
Yeah. So on a club level, the fact that we won the Premiership in 2006, we were the first team to win the league and win the tournament at the end of it and win the trophy. We're the first team to do that, and then I got Player of the Year that season. So that was a really big highlight. Winning that in Twickenham and against Leicester, who at the time were kind of like the Man United team, they were winning everything. Yeah. It's nice to get one off them. And then my first game for England, which went differently. I wasn't expecting to come off the bench, and I came off the bench and scored a try, so that was really memorable. But then one of the things in my head that's not quite obvious is when I played against the All Blacks in New Zealand.
Wow.
And we faced the Hacker. Now, you watch it on the TV or you watch it in the stadium, and it's phenomenal. But over there, they do it a bit different, and we're out in the middle of the pitch, we're sort of 10, 20 foot away from the Hacker. All stadium lights go out, all the advertising holdings flip round to black with the sun.
Wow.
And then the spotlight's on, and you got front row tickets to what is a phenomenal, spectacle.
Yeah.
So that one always sticks with me as a bit of a highlight. It would be nicer if it didn't drill us, but the Hacker was good to watch.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and that's the thing, really. I suppose it's sort of like obviously it's a tough team. Not many teams go to New Zealand and get much, to be fair, over the years, that's for sure. And I can imagine that's a huge experience in itself. But obviously, I mean, you play for some strong teams, Chris. That a lot of highlights there, that's for sure. And I suppose looking back on things, I know it's hard to sort of like to sort of pinpoint any sort of challenges, but just generally, what would you say in your career? What were any sort of challenges that I mean, you mentioned that being told you wouldn't make it at an early age, but what would you say would be your biggest challenge in your sort of career?
It was, I played at Sale Sharks for 10 years, and through that time I played a lot of rugby and took a lot of knocks, and I think the hardest thing for me was staying fresh, staying connected. I think it was really tough at the end of my career at Sale. They got a coach, Mike Brewer, came in, and the way he handled the club wasn't spectacular. And then when I went to Worcester, it just gave me a new lease of life. It refreshed me. It got me reconnected into a different environment. I look at players like, for example, Mark Waiter, who he spent his whole career at Sale Sharks, and it's pretty admirable the fact that he could continue the top of his game the whole time there. Well, the outside is changing, so it sort of is that inner drive kept him going to say that's not the game. And for me, leaving and going to Worcester, getting a whole different experience for me, which I really enjoyed, but also just freshened me up as well. And so one of the challenges was just trying to keep pushing yourself, and that new environment I think really did that for me.
No, that's interesting, and sort of outside rugby, obviously we sort of touched on very briefly the ambassador of the Cheshire Business School, and no doubt you've got a lot of skills to transfer across to business and other areas of life. I think that sport has got a lot to offer in terms of transference of skills, and you could just maybe sort of share an insight to the listeners in terms of what that role involves, and is there anything that you've sort of taken from playing rugby at the very highest level into sort of that role, and just sort of I suppose business in general, really?
Yeah, well, when I finished rugby, you sit back and you think, right, well, I'm a rugby player. I'm not going to play rugby. I don't really have any skills. And then I went to St James's Place, and I spoke to them about becoming a financial advisor, and they've got an academy that you can go through, which is really, really a good academy. And they've got a link with the rugby union now, where they're trying to help players and ex-players transition. And one of the first stages of that process is after sort of write an application of and why you think you'd be suitable. And it really makes you look at yourself and the skills that you need, in this case, to be a financial advisor. And actually, there's so much from playing, and I'll say rugby, but I'll go with team sports, there's so much transferable skills that set you apart from the competition. So there's little things that sound silly, but that perseverance too. We'll just talk about challenges that you face through your career. Instead of just falling, you find a way to overcome them. That's a thing that a lot of sportsmen have. Little things like timekeeping. In team sports, you turn up on time, but you don't want to let your teammates down. And it's certain little things like that that are really transferable into business. And what I found personally is having a bit of a story to go with whatever you're doing, whatever you're talking about.
Absolutely.
Having a story behind you, and in my world, the financial advice, it really helps, because a really good analogy is, I was playing sports. I didn't concentrate on writing the weight programs. I didn't concentrate on the nutrition. They have specialists in there to do that. So now I speak to people and I say, well, that's exactly like you now. You want to go out there, you work 9 to 5, you earn your money. You don't want them going home and trying to find out where to invest that. I'm a specialist. I'm like the doctor. I'm like the nutritionist. I'll concentrate on that, and then I'll make your money work for you. And you can concentrate on your day to day and do what you're good at. So it's a really good analogy there that for me helps me just bring a story to what I'm doing.
Absolutely. And in terms of like yourself, like going forward, Chris, your sort of like vision, where do you sort of see? I mean, obviously, sort of, you do the financial advising and you, the ambassador of Cheshire Business School, and I mean, in terms of like your own vision, do you see yourself maybe getting back into coaching? Were you going to sort of carry on, or would you go into coaching? Are you going to sort of carry on doing what you're doing? I know, obviously, to put you on the spot a little bit, but
I'm really enjoying what I'm doing at the moment, and one of the reasons, well, the many reasons I chose it. One of them was, for me personally, I've done my rugby time. I was involved for 16 years, and I did everything I was going to do. I achieved, and I was really happy with that. Now, stepping across the fence to be a coach, for me, that doesn't interest me. I wanted to sort of start a new chapter. For me, financial advice is that new chapter. It's completely different. It's challenging in different ways from what I've had in the past. And so far, I'm really, really enjoying it. And I can see it growing and growing. And every day is different. You meet new people. You meet different people, and you make plans and helping them with their journey. So I'm really enjoying what I'm doing. So So I made the right choice.
Absolutely, and I suppose that's sort of inspiring for anyone in any sport, sort of, moving towards the end of the career, wondering what they do next. And I think that, there is obviously opportunities out there, a whole wall of opportunities to transfer your skills in different areas, and like he says there, I think that's sort of a massive takeaway. We have a lot of sports people listen to the show in terms of what to do, and us at the end of a career, and sometimes sort of being able to be happy, content, however you want to put it, to say, well, you've done what you set out to do, and in a sporting career, and you can sort of move forward in different directions. That's sort of really interesting insights, Chris. But yeah, I mean, it's been great interviewing. I think it's been fascinating. Speaking to you. I'm sure the listeners have sort of enjoyed, and sort of got out of the interview as well. So I want to wish you all the best, Chris, in your sort of career, going forward. And thanks for joining us on the Friday Sports Show, 94.5 FM, Salford City Radio. For your host, Jimmy Petruzzi.
No problem. Thanks so much for having me. Really, really enjoyed our chat, and we will speak again soon.
Thanks, Chris.